Autism awareness is more than just a month. It's a movement for understanding, support, and inclusion. In this episode, we're going to dive into what it means to navigate the spectrum as a Black family and why representation is so important. Happy Autism Awareness Month, family, and welcome back to another impactful episode of the Melanin Wellness Podcast. Just as the intro indicated, we are going to be discussing autism in the Black community and how that looks for us and why that often looks so different and why it is coming with such a stigma within our community, and sometimes the lack of understanding leads to so many negative things. But today, I am hoping that this episode is going to give you a little more insight and understanding about exactly what autism is, some of the challenges and insights about it within our community. And I'm going to share a couple of personal stories with you, because if you have been listening to the show, you know that autism touched my family in a very unique way because two of my children are actually on the spectrum. But before I dive any deeper into today's episode, let us begin, as we always do, with 30 seconds of gratitude. I am so grateful for opening my eyes today. You know, again, as I say all the time, these are things that are often taken for granted. And they shouldn't be, because not everybody opened their eyes this morning. I am grateful for peace of mind, which right now, I know we all know can be very, very difficult to come by. But in light of all the things that we are dealing with, not just on a political scale or a daily scale, but even within our own familial situations, we may be dealing with multiple challenges, and you never know what someone else is dealing with. So I am very, very grateful for peace of mind. And today I am also continuously grateful for you, my audience. I really appreciate hearing from you all via text messages and emails and social media messages and comments that you leave on the episode. It really means a lot to me. And, you know, in the future, I'm going to have an episode where I do a listener podcast Q&A. So, I would really, really love it if you guys have a question about anything health and fitness related, or, you know, just any question at all, because there are some exciting changes coming up in this next season of the show. So that's just a heads up. But anyway, I already know that was more than 30 seconds of gratitude. And that's okay, because I say it all the time. When you focus on the beauty in what it is that you have been blessed with, it takes the focus off of what you don't have. And that way it opens up the door for more abundance, more blessings, more beautifulness to come into your life and into your world. Now, family, autism is something that doesn't discriminate, but awareness, resources, and support often do. So let's talk about it. Now, autism doesn't look the same for everyone, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we face, especially within the Black community. There are so many different ways that autism manifests itself in each person. My two children that are on the spectrum are so very different. They each have their challenges. However, they are so different, and the way the spectrum presents itself for them and in their lives is so completely different. One doesn't really have communication issues, while the other does have a little bit more difficulty with communication. So there are just so many different ways in which it shows up, and there are different levels of severity. So in some Black families and communities, there can be, and I've witnessed, a lack of understanding or acceptance of autism. And this often stems from generational beliefs about behavior, discipline, and expectations. And talks about phrases like they'll grow out of it, or they just need discipline. It can often delay important things like diagnosis and intervention. And early intervention when it comes to autism is absolutely critical because it lays the foundation for what happens moving forward. And I want to say that that is one of the things that has helped both of my children on the spectrum blossom and bloom and go on to achieve all the amazing things that they have done thus far. Many of the early behaviors of children on the spectrum are behavioral based, and it can be difficult to differentiate between normal behavioral issues and a much larger diagnosis such as autism. And so, for the sake of clarity, I want to explain what autism is. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects how a person communicates, how they learn, and how they understand the world around them. So many kids on the spectrum and adults on the spectrum, they don't do well with abstract concepts. So they are very literal, and so they take things very literally. So you have to kind of temper your language and rephrase things oftentimes to make sure that they understand exactly what's being said. And it's also important to note that it is still unclear what actually even causes autism, right? So, my journey with autism began when my child was about 2 or so. I started noticing differences because I noticed that there wasn't a lot of language skills there. I noticed that there were repetitive behaviors, and there were, I'm trying to think of the correct word I want to use for it. There were certain things that my child would not stop doing in terms of like self-soothing is what I know that's what it is now, but I didn't know that that's what it was then, right? I remember trying to take the pacifier away, and I remember that was such a challenge. Now I know, after all these years, that it just stemmed from the self-soothing piece. And once I was able to learn as much as I could about autism back then, I was able to take those things and view them differently and have a better understanding for why, letting go of the pacifier was such a thing at the time. I remember the initial reactions from my family and friends. I know that my closest friend, she was supportive. She didn't understand what autism was. However, I did explain it to her and tell her what it was. And, to her, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Like, she was supportive. She still is to this day. She absolutely loves them. She loves all my kids. However, within my own family, there definitely was resistance and denial. There were questions to me asked, like, what did you eat or drink during your pregnancy to cause this? And were you not sleeping properly? Were you not getting exercise? Like, did you take some form of medication or something that you shouldn't have taken? And I remember being heartbroken by that because the pregnancy was the same as it was with the rest of my children, for both of them. And so, trying to understand, because it's important to know that when you get that diagnosis of your child, and I know that from statistics, most Black families don't get a diagnosis as early as we did with our kids. Most Black families' diagnoses don't come until the child is more like 7 or 8. So my children were very young when we were able to get their diagnoses. And it was probably because I am a pushy mama. Okay. When it comes to my babies, I'm all in, 10 toes, 10 fingers, like whole body. I'm going in and I'm going to push and press and advocate for them with whatever resources and tools that I have at my disposal. And so the kids were 2 and 3 when I got their diagnoses. And again, like I stated, it showed up very differently for both of them. My other child on the spectrum had something called echolalia. And echolalia is where the child can hear what you're saying, but they simply echo back and repeat back exactly what you just said to them. So there's like a disconnect there. And, trying to navigate the feelings of abandonment by my family and the non-acceptance, of the way that they treated my children, but specifically the youngest one on the spectrum. And, and they did that all the way up until I made the decision that it was in my best interest and my children's best interest just for me to just cut contact. Because at the end of the day, I wholeheartedly believe that no matter what the relationship is, you don't have to put up with anybody being emotionally abusive and hurtful to you. Like, what we're not going to do is that. And I am a very black or white person when it comes to, it's either you want me in your life or you don't. And if you want me there, you're going to treat me right. And if you can't, then I must do what I need to do for myself to protect my own peace. And so, that was very difficult. And it is still difficult at times, because I get questions from the kids about the situation. But they definitely understand, because one thing about kids with autism is they don't forget anything. And so they will talk about the different stories and different experiences that they've had with family members that were unfortunately not very kind, not loving toward them. And so they get it then. When they recall these stories, they're like, now I see why you cut them out, So, but unfortunately, that often does happen for many families. And, that stigma of that the mother must have done something wrong, or, that there's, quote unquote, something wrong with the child. It definitely can prevent families from seeking help. And it leads to a lack of the resources, the support, and the advocacy. Because again, early intervention is key, because many children on the spectrum often need services like physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. And getting those services in early on, as early as possible, it definitely changes the game. I can tell you wholeheartedly, 100%. I have friends who have kids on the spectrum, and one in particular, she said to me, I wish that I would have advocated as hard for my child as you did for yours, because perhaps the way things turned out for him would have been differently. But you all know that in the Black community, it is difficult to acknowledge that, hey, something may not be, quote unquote, normal with our child. There is a stigma that comes with that. There's such a stigma that comes with that. And that's what I'm hoping this conversation does, is I'm hoping that it helps to break some of that by having open conversations, by educating people, and by creating bands and bands of community support. Now, one of the things that I really, really want to call on my listeners to do is to question those stereotypes and be mindful of the language when you are discussing autism. Autism is not mental retardation. And I have heard that parallel and using those terms intermingly and intertwining them, they are not interchangeable. Those are two very different learning disabilities. The importance of educating ourselves and being compassionate are some of the first steps towards breaking this cycle of stigma and embracing everyone in our communities. Now, the journey to getting a diagnosis, it can be long and frustrating. And for some Black families, it can be even more challenging due to systemic disparities. But again, I was very blessed that at the time that I found out about my children, where we were living was an amazing medical system, the absolute best medical system that I have ever dealt with in my entire life. And I was self-referring. I was on the phone. I was at the time on the internet. We were still on dial-up then, I think, y'all. And I was filled with a fire, determined to help my babies have as close to a normal life as I could. And all it took was that. Because once I began to almost be like a bulldozer, determined to make sure that they got the resources and services that they needed to help them along, I was met with open arms by the medical professionals that I was intertwined with. Black children are often diagnosed later, and I think I said that earlier, or even misdiagnosed compared to their white peers. And so that misdiagnosis or late diagnosis is critical with someone on the spectrum. It is wasting so much key time to help with some of the repetitive behaviors and help with some of the repetition that those on the spectrum often require in order to help them to retain information. Oftentimes, Black children are simply labeled as learning disabled or that they have a behavioral problem, making them targets within our educational systems for teachers who may have biases against Black children to begin with. Now, guys, I'm going to tell you something. I can remember when I was in school myself, I can remember that there were kids that they were put in this room and they were just labeled LD or learning disabled. And sitting back and looking now as an adult and thinking back to those times, I can almost bet that some of those kids were on the spectrum, but they did not know what autism was at that time. And so they weren't getting what they really needed so that they could thrive and live full lives. I think that, there are so many stereotypes when it comes to issues and diagnoses, even beyond autism. Diagnoses like ADHD and, oppositional defiance disorder and bipolar and things like that. When it comes to the Black community, I think there is such a stereotype and such a stigma behind these things because they often equate the child's behavior issues to parenting flaws as opposed to neurological differences. And again, that delays diagnosis, but it also casts a shadow of shame upon the parents. And the parents feel like, I'm doing the best that I can, and it makes them feel inadequate and as though it is something that they've done to cause this, and that if they just parent better, that it'll go away. And I think that that's the wrong approach, because I feel like that most parents do the best that they can. However, there are definitely those cases where they are not. Again, I believe I've touched on the fact that I was a volunteer CASA worker for 6 years within the juvenile foster care system. And so unfortunately, I saw many cases where the children were not being cared for the way that they needed to be. However, I do believe that most parents do the best that they can. And so making the parent feel as though if they were doing more of this or less of that, or, that maybe the child wouldn't be behaving this way. And I think that it's very important to be mindful and, careful about saying those things, because again, there are so many things that are in our environments that unknowingly are causing issues for our bodies. I mean, we have 1,000,001 commercials on the TV about if you use Tylenol, you may be eligible for compensation. If you used hair relaxers, you may be eligible for compensation. If you drink water from this area during this time period, you may be eligible for compensation. So when we think about healthcare as a whole, we want to make sure that we are taking into account that there are many factors that could be playing a role, and bad parenting has nothing to do with autism. One of the things I also want to touch on is that my doctors were absolutely amazing. They took my concerns seriously immediately, and they did the test, and then we found out immediately. But I do remember that my world was absolutely rocked because, first of all, I had no idea what autism was. And, I want to say I gave myself 48 hours to just catch my breath. Then I began researching. Once I began researching, I needed another 48 hours because my world was rocked. Because all of the things that I was told, all the doom and gloom about autism, I remember I was told that my children wouldn't do some very basic things like go to the restroom on their own. They would never be able to formulate friendships and emotional attachments. I'll never forget the first time that I heard my children saying, "Mommy," I cried because I was told that there was not going to be that. And now they won't stop saying it. Now, here are a few tips that I want to give someone who may be wondering if their child is on the spectrum and how you can advocate best for your child if you feel dismissed in any way by a healthcare professional. So make sure you're keeping a journal of behaviors and developmental milestones. My journals were critical. Next, get a second opinion if your concerns are not being acknowledged. It's the same thing that I state about you. If you feel like that you're going to the doctor and your doctor is not listening and he's not hearing your concerns, it is time for a second opinion. It's time for a second opinion. And do not hesitate to ask for assessments from specialists because that's what specialists are there for. Specialists, that's what they do. They specialize in this. So don't be afraid to ask to get some additional testing and additional assessments just to put your mind at ease so that if that's not what it is, that's great. Now let's go on and find the next thing so that you can do the best you can to give your child the best outlook and the best life that they can possibly have. We want our kids to have full lives. Now, there are organizations and support networks specifically aimed at helping Black families navigate the whole world of autism and the autism spectrum, like the Color of Autism Foundation and Autism in Black. They both offer culturally relevant resources, parent training, and advocacy services. So the links for both of those will be in the show notes. And also seek out community-based resources, including local autism advocacy groups that understand the cultural nuances. It's definitely okay to feel overwhelmed and frustrated because I definitely did. Like the grief that I felt took a long time to subside, but I was working and fighting and advocating for my kids nonetheless. And just because perseverance is key. Being persistent is the only way that you're going to make sure that you give your child the opportunity and the resources and the tools to live this full life. And make sure that you celebrate the strength that it takes to push for answers and support. Because when I tell you it is a long, hard fought journey, it's so hard. But you can do it. You can definitely do it. It definitely does take a village, but finding your village when you're raising children with autism often feels impossible. As I stated before, to be honest, my husband and I have not had a village. It has just been us. And it has been rough at times. But we have made it. We have made it. The communities in which we've lived in haven't had a lot of resources for children of color on the spectrum, so that definitely made it a challenge. I would find some online resources. So if you live in smaller areas, definitely look into online resources to find what's nearby, because oftentimes these things aren't advertised. So find other parents and caregivers who truly understand. Again, online communities can be lifesaver, especially when local resources are limited the way that they are. Now, while my husband and I unfortunately were unable to find community, I would definitely suggest that if you can find community, find one. It is going to be so impactful and so helpful for you to have someone else who really understands what you're going through, to, be able to talk to, vent to, because only someone in your situation dealing with this knows what you're feeling. If you don't have a group chat, you can create one where families can share tips and resources and encouragement to each other, because again, community is important. To be honest, sometimes I do not know how we made it, especially me, because I was at home. I gave up my career to stay home and care for my children so that I could be there, for the meetings and the doctor's appointments and things like that. So while I had, college education, it was my duty to be home to care for my children. So, yeah. Also, make sure that you build relationship with your child's educators. And, that is going to be key to making sure that your child gets what they need. Because one thing I do know for certain, especially within the Black community for Black children, if they are perceived that no one really cares or that the attention is kind of lackadaisical, that is precisely how they will treat your child. However, when they know that those kids have a pit bull behind them, trust me when I tell you, they're on their P's and Q's. And definitely if they want to create an IEP, which is an individualized education program, definitely get that in place because it supports their unique needs. It gives them certain accommodations to help them better succeed and thrive in school. I am telling you the advocacy, that I was able to do for my kids, making sure that they would have read aloud tests if they needed them, small group testing, making sure that if they needed to be pulled out for one-on-ones, occupational therapy, speech therapy, all of those things were absolutely critical to helping my kids be successful, right? So don't be afraid to speak up for your babies. Do not. Like I'm telling you right now, my reputation precedes me when it comes to my children and school. Because I don't play that. As we get ready to close out the show, I want you to know that raising a child with autism can be mentally and emotionally exhausting. I would know the mental and emotional strain that it has taken on me and on my family at times has been, I can't even think of the correct word. It's been really tough. So seeking out therapy or support groups is definitely a suggestion. I would definitely recommend you do that because self-care isn't selfish. It is absolutely essential to making sure that you remain as mentally and emotionally well balanced as possible. Making sure you're eating properly, making sure you're sleeping properly is going to be key, is going to be critical because your child needs every bit of fight that they can get. It's okay to have hard days. I've been there, done that. But being there, advocating and loving your child unconditionally are the wins within themselves. I'm going to be honest, I could not be more proud of my babies. They are going to have some amazing stories to tell when they are ready to tell their own stories. Family, I thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. I hope you took something valuable away from this episode. And let's spark these conversations and start having these conversations about something that affects our community, especially in light of the things that are happening politically. We all need to gather around each other and put those loving arms around one another and support each other. As usual, you guys know how to find me. If you loved this work, please consider supporting me on my Buy Me a Coffee. As always, that link will be in the show notes. And if you would like to connect with me further, you can always feel free to shoot me an email at the Melanin Wellness Podcast at gmail.com. And yeah, connect with me on socials. Until next episode, family, everyone continue to love each other and support each other. Take care, family.